Here I am live once again. For those of you that might have hopped on a moment ago, I apologize. Let's get Michelle Cassandra Johnson on to join us. You're doing some writing now?
I am. Well, I was writing an endorsement for someone else's book, but I am writing another book right now.
Wow. So your second book came out just what, 3 weeks ago, something like
Right.
that?
Yeah, 3 weeks ago.
And you just don't even need to catch your breath, just getting back into it, huh?
I am getting back into it, which feels good. It's a lot with everything that's going on, and it feels good.
Yeah, yeah. Well, because I was, thinking of how mine came out on the 27th, and I thought that I would be in this place of just jubilation. And I've actually been in a place of a lot of emotionality, and a lot of it feels like maybe 18 months of grief that I didn't tend to because I wanted to just channel and manifest this project. And so your work and listening to your podcast has been really helpful at this time to understand, why am I having these emotions that don't seem to correspond with how I thought I would feel at this point. So I just want to thank you for that. And really want to just hear more about your experience of coming to write the book, and really the message you want to share. Because I know I personally have found it to be such a soulful way to connect with grief in a way that others, when I've heard others, teach or talk about it, it hasn't resonated in the same way that your work has. So tell us more about how the inception of this amazing book.
Yeah. Well, really, I mean, the essence of it is about my ancestors and receiving the message that I would need to both hold the space for people who are grieving and write this book. And the space holding came first, that information, and then it manifested in creating and writing Finding Refuge. So that's the short answer of where the idea for this came from. But the experience, which is the introduction of being cracked open because of the oppression in the world and the trauma we're all experiencing, I feel like really allowed me to write a book that is both about how we tend to our grief and respond to our grief individually and collectively. And you said, some folks have written about, I mean, many people have written about grief before, and that it hasn't always resonated with you. And what I appreciate about what was channeled and moved through me for Finding Refuge is the balance of my own personal storytelling with an awareness of how connected my grief is to others' grief and our collective grief, and really wanting to deepen a conversation about grief together. I want us to be in space talking about what we're holding in our hearts.
Well, and that element too of it being so, you really speaking the truth to the embodiment aspect of it too, and maybe as fellow yoga teachers, and I really appreciate that element too. And we think of how it lands in our body, and in differently from person to person, body to body, obviously depending on our life experiences and the ways that we brush up against the way society and systems have also treated us in our bodies based on race and class, those sorts of issues. And so I think that both the spiritual and the embodied elements are really making it such a nuanced way to have the conversation around grief, and such a necessary way to have the conversation. So do you feel like, as a yoga teacher, well, and I know you do a lot of also other spiritual and intuitive work. I almost want to just have today also be about your work doing Akashic readings too. I'll have to schedule something with you to talk about that later. Schedule an appointment with you. But as a yoga teacher, tell me about how you feel like that might be something that has just helped you with your own grief.
Well, when I entered into yoga teacher training, I'd been practicing for many years and began yoga teacher training right before we started. My friend Eric passed away, transitioned. And there's chapter 4 is about Eric and intuition and the heart's wisdom and finding refuge. And so I entered into teacher training and learning about the philosophy of yoga and how to become more embodied as I was moving through deep grief. because the loss was very unexpected. And he was 39, he was young. So I think that really, I mean, it informed everything, and certainly how I experienced learning more about the practice, and even thinking about how I would teach and space hold and offer the practice to others and with others. So it was my entry point into deepening my study of yoga. And I know this is true for many people, actually, because I've led a lot of teacher trainings, that I feel like a lot of times people come to teacher training not only to deepen their study of yoga, but to respond to their own suffering and to try to understand more and like manage suffering and respond to it. So I think it's more common than not for us to show up with deep grief in our hearts as we practice and as we learn more and as we're in different sanghas and communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that. I mean, my mom brought yoga into my life, and then I really got into it much more in graduate school. And then, but I was thinking of how much my mom informed my book. She passed away in May after having maybe dementia, early onset dementia. And so talk about a really ambiguous loss and expanded over so many years. And I think that normally I would be more connected to that in my body if I was getting on the mat as I used to back when she also helped me get there. But in some ways, my yoga practice has been in the writing. But now maybe that's why now I'm finding myself with this release in my body. But did you grow up with a mom that also was just really, that was embodied or encouraged you to be connected to your body or connected to your emotions and things like grief?
So interesting. My mom's name is Clara. She gave me different messages about grief, but I would say she didn't practice an embodied practice that I'm aware of. She was raising 2 children on her own. She was working full-time as a special education teacher. And I think how she practiced her yoga is in her classroom, because she loved her students so much, and she taught me a lot about compassion and generosity. So that was my first exposure to what I would call yoga, although that's not what we were calling it then, and she didn't practice that. And I think in a lot of ways she didn't have time to notice what was going on with her body, or how the culture was treating her, or how she was responding to it, because of so many demands on her, and it would have required her to slow down. And I think for a long period of time she just had to keep going to take care of us. And so her care wasn't always prioritized as we were growing up. And I think that's a pattern, that's an ancestral pattern. And I definitely received the message from her of not of positivity being the way to be, but of like, endure, be strong, feel a different way. And I think that was her coping. I think she didn't have time to grieve, and who was going to hold her grief anyway? I think that was what was going on for her. So I learned a lot about the cost of not grieving, and have thought a lot about what it meant for her to care for us so well and not be cared for in a lot of ways, and not be resourced, and not just financially, but the resources we need to fill our spirits and feel nourished, right? She didn't have much of that because she was giving all of that to us. So I think it has some to do with identity. You know, I'm a Black person. She was a Black single mother, right? And it also has to do with how, in my experience in the Black community, at times we do have to endure and move through and keep going. And so it's a real practice to learn how to slow down and do the heart work that I share in Finding Refuge.
Yeah, right. And I have read, just doing a lot of work on pleasure activism and pleasure reclamation, reading Adrienne Brene Brown stuff has been, really, I mean, just I'm so rocked by a lot of her work too, along those lines of just, being able to reclaim pleasure and joy in a world that is not only not supporting it, but doing everything to really interfere with that. And I was really moved by a story that you shared too about in your yoga teacher training, how you had said there were teacher or teachers that had suggested that your yoga practice could just lead you to transcend or, essentially bypass your experience as a Black woman in this world. Is that right? That's the message you
Yeah.
got.
And I think that wasn't a direct message. I think that's the message that, I mean, transcending was a direct message, but not because of my Blackness. Like, no one said that to me, or no one said, we don't feel like marginalized groups are deserving of this practice. And yet that's so much of how the industry has operated for such a long time. And I think the culture of it shifting because more people are talking about how exclusionary it is and has been. And I think it's the bypassing, it's messy because the practice does talk about transcendence and absolute truths and being absorbed into oneness and me being part of everyone. And it also talks about our suffering and how we respond to it, which means we have to look at it. And so we can't transcend it. We have to be with it, and work towards, I feel like, in my experience, living a life that will allow me to transition with ease once I leave my body, and to know that I've left this space, my corner of the world, in better shape than I found it, or how I came into this being or incarnation of myself.
Do you feel like, so in your teachings, because you teach courses, can you tell us some about like the courses that you do and the focus in your yoga classes or trainings rather?
Yeah, I teach a lot of trainings and immersions focused on my first book, Skill in Action. And there's another edition of that, second edition, coming out in the end of October. And so prior to COVID, I was traveling around the country 2 to 3 times a month in yoga communities, spiritual communities, yoga teacher trainings, offering content around how to radicalize our spaces, and really to deepen our understanding of why the culture of yoga, meaning the industry of yoga in the West, has been so exclusionary. And then I invite people into considering how they can disrupt the patterns of exclusion and dominance and superiority and oppression, and how they can feel inspired to know they have a role in responding to the suffering and make change. So that's been Skill in Action. I've been doing that online since COVID happened. I mean, there's more to Skill in Action. It is about how the practice really guides us to creating conditions for justice, right? And creating conditions for everyone to thrive. So that's the essence of it. And then the practicality around, teaching people about how to infuse this intersection of justice and yoga into their teaching as well. Like, how do I talk about it in a 60-minute asana class or a meditation? That is part of Skill in Action too. And as I was writing Finding Refuge, and I'm doing it now too, thinking about different offerings I want to make. So I'm creating some new content, curriculum, rituals around Finding Refuge, because so many of the practices are rituals and meditations and movements and pranayama. So I'm thinking about how to create this, weekend workshops or an hour-long ritual or practice, or if people want to lead a healing circle around grief. I just created a guide for that.
I just bought one of your divination decks, by the way.
Yeah.
And I think I might need to buy in bulk, just because there won't be a shortage of people in my life and community that, will need it now and continue to. So
that's true.
I love that, just in the beauty, and also just some of the sort of the prompts and also the ways in which to bring something like it feels like you're making or helping to make grief feel also more poignant rather than just something to avoid. And also, I know you talk about just this idea of why are we isolating so much,
right,
in our grief too. And so both like your trainings and offerings, I think, are so essential so that people aren't feeling alone, or that they're bad or wrong or have a mental health problem, because this is a natural part of being human, essential part to connect to.
Yes, and I always say, I mean, we are in bodies that will not be here forever. So in a way, we need to be aware of it and make space to grieve the temporariness of our existence in this way as individuals, and be able to have more tools to grieve other beings and dreams and relationships, and the planet and what's happening to the planet as well. So it is my hope that people feel less isolated, and less pathologized, to speak to what you said about mental health, and that grief, as you said, it is a natural part of being alive, right? Being awake,
Yeah.
being alive, being aware. We are all going to grieve, and in fact, I think we all are grieving. We may not, or hold grief in our bodies. We may not be aware of it or call it grief, but it's present. So I'm hoping Finding Refuge will allow people to really honor, this is grief because I have lost something, someone, an experience.
Like I've learned over the years that for me, it presents initially as agitation, and I'll be annoyed and angry and reactive, and then one thing leads to another, and I'll surrender, and I'll really get to kind of the core, which is the sadness, and then the tears, and that there's just like a raw truth that I've come to really like. I received that because then I realized, all of the other, all the agitation was misdirected grief that I wasn't really acknowledging, that wanted attention. And now here I am really in it, giving it that space. But it's taken me a long time to get to that point of realizing that, and that's what I try to help my clients with as well. But do you notice that happens with a lot of people? Like they feel more comfortable with, anger is this, it has, a real charge, and that feels more empowering versus the vulnerability of grief.
And yes, I've been thinking about this for myself because over the last week, I've been feeling more anger and feeling like the world, I've been in my home by myself or with my dog Jasper, but feeling like the world is really loud. So, which is interesting to me. I had a concussion in 2014, and I'm almost feeling that way, like what is happening energetically in the world. And I realized yesterday you're angry because you're grieving, and what I'm grieving is the ways we continue to not prioritize collective care. And I'm concerned about what is going to happen, and that was expressed as anger. And then I just said to myself, you're grieving, you're holding a lot of grief and concern and worry, because I don't know what will happen, and yet I see the things unfolding and playing out that will get in the way of us really taking care of each other, which is what I so desperately want us to do.
I really came into doing a lot of, or learning a lot more about collective care through doing trainings with Off the Mat Into the World. And I know Carrie Kelly was part of, when I first started with Off the Mat, she was like their head honcho, however we want to refer to her, because she's a, a badass in my mind. And I know that I just listened to actually you on her Citizen podcast, but that they were, by forging and really integrating yoga and social justice issues, that was huge for me to really wake up and continue to wake up. Not that I'm woke and I got it all figured out, but just to constantly be checking myself and my privilege and my bias and my ignorance. And I think that's actually how I first heard about you, and then through Shambhala, and just them, advocating for you or sharing some of your posts and things. And it's got to be an interesting sort of, do you find yourself that there'll be a group of just like upper middle class white women that do yoga that then want you to come, and do you feel like, do you have to kind of grimace to get there and face that group, or is it just you welcome anybody who wants to learn your teachings?
It's so interesting you asked this, because a friend of mine said, this was about a month and a half ago, and she said, you will allow, I have boundaries, but pretty much like anyone to come into your offerings, and you'll offer the teachings. And she said, you must empty out before you show up to teach, to hold a space where you're not exactly sure what's going to happen and what people will share, and the different identities, to your point, that people bring in, and the demographic you named. If, I've been in spaces that have been predominantly white teaching skill and action or dismantling racism training, and there's eagerness to learn. And if there are folks of color in that space, often that learning is at their expense. And so I have to respond to that tension, or I say things that white-bodied folks are not ready, willing to hear or receive. And I try not to get caught up in that, because I know there was a time when I didn't know what I know now. So there's that. The practice also helps me be compassionate and set boundaries in this space to try to create a space where people feel held. And to know really what I'm doing in those spaces is raising consciousness. So even if someone doesn't want to hear what I say in that moment, it's probably going to sit with them if it created some emotional energy, right? It's probably going to nag at them. And perhaps later, 10 years later, a year later, I don't know, it will allow them to be open to understanding that the world may actually be a different way than they thought, than they've been conditioned to believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not easy work to be an activist, and a lot of my activism is around sexual trauma and body terrorism, and even just the bodies being marginalized, and then of course different bodies that don't look a certain way, have a certain skin color, performative value ableism, and I think at first I felt like, who am I to, or what kind of judgment will there be for, as a woman, just to talk about sex? I'm not supposed to, because then that would, I'd be a slut or I'm a nympho or something. And it's become something now that has really drives me all the more, that if I believe in this so strongly, and having grown up in a sex positive household and seeing the extent to which there's so much trauma in the body and sexual trauma, that how can I not? I don't know if there was ever a time where it was hard for you to really step up and really share your message for fear of how you would be judged.
My mom, thank you, Clara. She really encouraged me to be in integrity and to speak up and to share my experience with an awareness that it's not everyone's experience, and to listen. And so, I feel like I, gained my courage, or got my courage from my mom, and then life experience and resilience, but really from her and my ancestors, because I'm not fearless, and I do feel clear I have something to share and say, and show up and share it, and let it be in this space, and live in this space, and inside people's hearts and spirits. So yes, I'm sure I've had a time when I've been like, I don't want to go out there and say this thing. That's human, right? And I feel like I'm so deeply connected to my purpose. And I have supports, people and ancestors that have transitioned who are holding me in that. So I won't say it's easy now to do it. And there is ease, because I'm not alone. Like, my great grandmother's with me when I'm offering something about social justice and yoga, or talking about white supremacy, or my grandmother is, right? Like, I'm not alone, and that gives me a lot of courage and will and strength.
Yeah, and thank you for reminding me, and any listener too that might need to hear that to call in and recognize the ancestral support and influence. And I also like how, just from what I can tell, you're really tapped into like astrological energy, right? I'm an Aquarius. I don't know if that's part of what led me to go into being a relationship and sex therapist that talks about bodyfulness, but yeah, I think it has something to do with it.
Yeah, probably. I'm an Aquarius moon, so and a Leo sun, so it's my season as well.
Yeah. Now, somebody had asked a question earlier when I was talking about your decks, if you had one to hold up. I don't know if you have one there, but it's also on your website.
I just did an intuitive healing this morning with someone, and I pull a card at the end of it. So it may be hard to see, but this is one side of the deck. The deck is called Transverse. And then each card, I'll hold up a card. The ancestor card's actually on the bottom. There's a crab shell there and ancestors written on it. So each card is a photograph. I took all of them except for two, that has a word. And then there's a booklet that goes along with it. And the booklet has interpretations for each card and a mantra that goes with each card. And so I have this size, and then I have a much smaller size, which is on my bookshelf that has the image and the mantra on it, if folks want that. And it's available on my website. And I actually created it before again, I think the ancestors knew what was going to happen, but I created it in 2017, and it was after my father transitioned, and I created it. Then my grandmother transitioned, so they were the bookends for my creating this deck to help people move through grief, which I think is really synchronous in so many ways.
Yeah. Well, I'm so honored to get to have this chance to talk with you and to, just continue to share in your work and learn more, and hopefully meet you in some capacity face to face. I think Shambhala should have a big summer party for all of us that just release books. Yeah, I don't know what that would entail. I would say some champagne. That would be pleasurable for me, but I don't know that that's going to happen.
We can call that in and maybe manifest it. But yes, it's great to meet you, and I hope we do meet sometime in some way, in person or otherwise, get to talk again. And thank you for your work too, and your book as well.
Have a wonderful day. Thank you,
You
Michelle.
too. Take care.